It's the longest of the Gospels, Gospel of Luke, and it has the most details. So much so that he probably interviewed Mary, the Blessed Mother, the mother of Jesus, because he's the only one that tells us anything about the life of Jesus prior to his public ministry. As a child, he has that account of Jesus being lost in the temple and looking for where would he get that from? Not the apostles.
No.
It had to be from Mary. So he must have gone around and had really good way of gathering information in order to create this complete and beautiful report of who is this Jesus. Now Luke, we know who he wrote this gospel for, and the Acts of the Apostles as well. He wrote it for one person. So think about it, writing a whole book for one person. And the person is named Theophilus. At the beginning of Acts, the name of the recipient for whom he is writing is Most Excellent Theophilus. Who was this Theophilus? Scholars don't know exactly, but by the title, the way he addresses him, it's suggested that he was a Roman official. Because Most Excellent is not just something you say to anyone, it was an official title of a Roman official. So let's save questions for later if you don't mind, because we're live, so it's not gonna. I'll just do the presentation, then we'll do questions, okay? So Most Excellent Theophilus. There are many theories out there. The majority of scholars will say that he was probably a new convert to Christianity from the Roman officials, and he probably hired Luke and paid him well to give him the most detailed account of the life and work of Jesus. The minor report or theory amongst the scholars is the one I like more. Again, we don't know which one is true. We're just saying these are theories. So the other theory is that Theophilus was a Roman official, a judge who was in charge of making a decision about Paul when Paul was imprisoned in Rome. So Luke accompanied Paul. When Paul was imprisoned in Rome, there had to be a trial. And what do you need for the trial? You need a detailed account, a defense of who is this person. So it's possible that Luke is writing for this Roman official who's going to be involved in the trial of Paul and gathering all the information in order to have a fair trial. What supports this theory is that in both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, the innocence of Jesus and the innocence of Paul is proclaimed by Roman officials over and over again. So Luke goes out of his way to say, Pilate proclaims that this man is innocent about Jesus. Or the Roman soldier, centurion, says this man was innocent. So 3 times in the gospel, Romans are proclaiming, Luke says that Romans saw that Jesus was innocent, and 3 times in the Acts of the Apostles, it's the same thing said about Paul, that Paul was seen as innocent. So so the theory is that he wrote both an act of the life of Jesus and the innocence of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, and then that the Acts of the Apostles is really the Acts of Paul. Because the minute you get to Paul, in the Acts of the Apostles, there's no more talk about the other apostles. It's all about the ministry of Paul, and it ends with the imprisonment of Paul in Rome. It doesn't say anything beyond that. So the theory would be that these both documents were prepared for that purpose, and that Paul was actually freed from his imprisonment in Rome and continued on, as we know. So, interesting theories, but we know it was written for this Most Excellent Theophilus. It's written with impeccable research and great attention to detail. Also, what's unique about Luke is it's the most emotionally engaging gospel. So you know how we went through the gospels. We said the first gospel, the gospel of Matthew, is the earliest gospel was Mark, and it was the shortest. Matter of fact, he did this, then immediately he did this, immediately he did this. So that was kind of a very fast pace, just facts about Jesus. Then Matthew goes a little bit more about the teachings of Jesus. Now Luke goes even further by highlighting not just the teachings of Jesus, but the depth of the spirituality of Jesus by employing something we know very well, which is the parables. So whenever you hear a parable, it's Luke, primarily Luke. We know all the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of lost coins, and all the parables have to do with something that Luke was very focused on, that Jesus came primarily for the lost, for the sinner, for the Gentile. He was writing as a Gentile himself. He was writing to the Gentiles, to the Romans, and he was writing about this person, Jesus, who continually was seeking the lost, the Gentiles. So there is no kind of heavy Old Testament imagery that we see in Mark and Matthew, because Luke is very focused on the heart of Jesus. It's often referred to as the gospel of mercy, the gospel of compassion, because it pulls you in with these parables, with these deep stories about as I said, the prodigal son who is lost, and the woman caught in adultery, and all those events where the sinner is the one that Jesus really wants to reach out to. Jesus is primarily seen as, in the Gospel of Luke, as the Savior of the world. So not only the Savior of the Jewish people or the Redeemer, so in Matthew he's seen as the King or the Messiah, because that was the image of the Old Testament. In Mark he's seen as the suffering servant. So again, the image of Old Testament Isaiah. But here he's seen simply as the Savior of the world. A very military imagery. You know, you're gonna who are saviors? Well, the military that comes to save you from oppression. You know, so he's the Savior of the world. He's the one who comes after those who are lost, those who are in need, and he draws us in through parables, prayers. The role of women is very important in the Gospel of Luke. Women are seen as, again, because he focuses on the outcasts. Women were not seen as very trustworthy even witnesses, because they, at that time in their culture, unfortunately, women and children are seen as less than men. And so Jesus highlights those who are seen as less. So you see in the Gospel of Luke, even more so than in the other Gospels, this idea of a great reversal, right? Like we hear in the Magnificat, in the Song of Mary, my soul magnifies the Lord, because he will cast out the mighty from their thrones, and he will lift up the poor and the lonely. So there's this reversal. The ones who are proud will be humbled, and the ones who are humble will be exalted. The ones who see themselves as religiously virtuous will be humbled, and the ones who see themselves as sinners will be justified in the eyes of God. So there's that great reversal where humility and humility is very important. The whole structure of Luke is very similar to the other Gospels, where you have the early ministry of Jesus is the first section. There is the passion, death, and resurrection is the third section. And the middle section, the one with all the parables, is his journey to Jerusalem. So he goes from Galilee to Jerusalem to die and to rise from the dead. So that's the middle section where you have all those beautiful parables and teachings about that we know so well from Luke. Okay. In the first section, really what we have is mostly miracles and signs of Jesus, and then teachings, and then the resurrection. So here are some questions you may want to consider when reading the Gospel of Luke. First, I would encourage you to read it with, if you're looking for an experience of God rather than just a knowledge of God, then I would read Luke. Luke really makes you feel things, draws you in, especially, as I said, with the parables, where we are invited into the scene, and we are invited to feel what God feels and not just to think. It's also very interesting that God would choose a doctor, a physician, to write about the virgin birth. Because doctors are all about data, right? This doesn't happen. Or to write about miracles. Because as a doctor, as a scientist, as a physician, he would have questioned these things, and only by the strength of the witnesses would he be convinced, even against his better judgment. So it's interesting that you have here an intellectual and a scientist and a doctor who, through great research, is able to confirm the miracles, including the virgin birth, and write about it very beautifully. So you can look at some discussion questions if you want to have a discussion afterwards. Here on page 2, why do you think God chose a Gentile doctor to write one of the Gospels? That's one of the questions we can look at. Which parable or story in Luke touches you most? So everyone has their favorite parables. And then why? Every parable is really about the same thing, just from a different perspective. How does Luke's emphasis on prayer challenge your own prayer life? So Luke is very, very strong on prayer. In what ways does Jesus care for outsiders, and does Jesus' care for outsiders challenge how we treat people today? So who do we see as outsiders today, and how do we care for them? So that's just a little summary on the Gospel of Luke. As you read through it, you will find that parts of it you will know very well, and those are parts that are unique to Luke. And then other parts, it seems that we have a tendency, we don't know Luke very well, because if it's also in the other Gospel, we tend to read it in the other Gospel, because it's shorter and more to the point. But Luke he's lengthier. He goes a little bit deeper into the details and into the emotions of these events. So sometimes that's why people don't know him as well, because they just want bare facts, and so they'll go to Mark or Matthew. But it's important to read Luke as a whole, to read the Gospel with all, even the known details about the life of Jesus that you know from Mark and Matthew. It's good to read Luke's account of those events as well. So I'll end it there, and then we'll continue our discussion, and our online people can have their own. Okay, Roger, the floor is yours.
Okay.